Well, good morning to our guests, but also to our community. I'm Steve Arviska. I'm Executive Director for Big Sky Economic Development. And each year in the fall, in October, we have an annual meeting. Obviously, this year's annual meeting is different than any other annual meeting I've ever experienced. You're going to hear a great message from myself and folks I would consider to be my colleagues. We are joined today by two leaders of TIP strategies. And I'm smiling when I say that because I've had the opportunity to spend about 8 months with some of the great people at TIP strategies, because TIP did Montana's review of our economic development and community development infrastructure. And Jeff Marcel was a huge part of that. And Elizabeth, and both of them did a fantastic job. Well, I'm joined today by two of their colleagues, Jon Roberts and Tracye McDaniel. And Jon, you've been with TIP for over 20 years. You're the managing partner. I was reading your bio today, Jon. So interesting, all the things that you've been involved in entrepreneurship and creating these great companies. How do you go from the technology world and then the cycling world? And so you bring such an interesting context to the work of economic recovery and economic development. So I'm very excited that you're joining me this morning. And then your colleague, Tracye, is the president of TIP Strategies. And wow, how many governors have you worked with over the years in giving them guidance about economic development and community development, and then working internationally in the same place, helping to market business development opportunities on an international scale. And so both of you bring such great expertise to this dialogue this morning. And I just want to thank you for joining me and helping educate me and our community a little bit about our common opportunity and challenge that we call economic recovery. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but welcome. Thank you for joining me. I just before getting on this call, I finished another call with our public health officer. So first thing Monday morning, I'm on the line talking with him about what's going on with our COVID cases and trying to understand how that's going to continue to impact our business community. We, as you may know, Billings, Montana is a regional center for a lot of things. We're a trade center for agriculture. We're a trade center for natural resource development. We are a hub for commerce. We're a trade center for healthcare. Even though our community is about 160,000 or so county-wide, our catchment area for healthcare is 650,000. So people from a broader region of Montana and part of the Dakotas and Wyoming come to Montana to do business, and then in this case, healthcare. So we're like every other community across the country in this kind of mix and hodgepodge of trying to work through the pandemic, but also work through gaining traction and economic recovery. And it's just like a roller coaster that you can't get off of, and the person holding the lever to stop the car is not letting you get off. That car is in place. So is that a similar experience to what other communities are going through right now, this kind of roller coaster? Tell me what's going on in the rest of the country as you work with communities across the nation.
Jon, you kick it off.
Well, I'll let Tracye kick it off. Go ahead, Tracye.
No, when I hear that, we have a lot of clients who are in the same boat that you're in. We're all in this together. We're trying to sort it out and really understand what recovery looks like. And I think this exercise is, I call it the big experiment, right? So this experiment is a little different because so many times the chase is for the normal. We're not chasing a normal today. It's definitely a new. And so how do we discern, what discernment do we use to identify what do we want to capture and make our new normal? And some of the things that we're going through, and Jon and I will talk about these, are trends that we're seeing. What will we adapt to for a new future? And I think that's what all communities are looking at today.
Jon, anything to add there? I have an interesting
Yeah.
thought there. If you think of how we respond to emergencies, right? There's that initial response mode, and then you start to transition into recovery. To me, it kind of feels like we're doing both. We're trying to move through into recovery, gain some traction there, but we're still responding. What's your take on that?
Well, we decided very early on as a company that we would focus less on the short term, and really, because it was so fluid and so uncertain, that we felt that we would bring more value to our clients if we took a longer term view. And that longer term view, as Tracye was saying, invited us to think about what are the trends that had been in place, Steve? What are the things that were already happening, and how was COVID-19 accelerating those trends? That became our template. And what we quickly realized was that it was a very useful way of thinking about what was going to happen, not so much for predicting the future, but for laying out scenarios that communities could use. So if you say, what are those trends in retail, in commercial office space, in transportation, in the use of incentives, in the supply chain, all those things, what were those trends, and what has COVID done to accelerate them, or in some cases to retard them? And then, this is the part where it gets so interesting, is what are the cascading effects from each of those? So if you look at retail and you see people buying more things online, that of course was a linear trend that we all knew. We were all buying more. But when we took a look at the actual numbers, Steve, what we saw was that in 2000, I think less than 2% of all of our purchases were online. At the end of 2019, it was still only about 16%. And then in the last 3 quarters, it's doubled. So we've gone from a linear progression to an algorithmic progression. And that's the way that we think we can best contribute to this discussion. And then the cascading effects are, how many new stores are going to open up? What will happen to the existing ones? What do we need the parking lots for? And the ripple effects become really interesting.
I want to talk a little bit more about that future forward kind of dialogue that we need to have based on those trends. How are other communities approaching their recovery efforts?
Yeah, I would jump in to say you guys are doing exactly what we're seeing across the country. It's doing that assessment of where are we now and looking at where the greatest needs and opportunities are in a community to come together for recovery. And I think that's the way we all are looking at it. And it's really important. I think the other thing that you see, and we'll touch on this, is in our communities where some of the biggest disparities are the most vulnerable populations. And how do we make sure that as we look at recovery strategies, they are a part of that dialogue and that recovery also.
Let me really echo what Tracye said. We're hearing that everywhere, and I can't agree more with Tracye's point, because if you look at these trends that we were talking about, and then you look at them through an equity lens, and I think the equity lens, Steve, is complicated because it is racial, for sure, but it's also overall disparity. And that disparity can be rural, urban. You have one of the things that you have in your recovery plan that Tracye and I talked about, you have an emphasis on broadband. It is another one of those trends that was hugely important before, but it's gone from linear to algorithmic. We need to ensure that everyone, and whether it's education or medicine or any number of other things, the ability to work from home, clearly. If you don't have that, and if you don't emphasize it, you're not going to get it. And it's not an issue for Tracye and me. We argue whether we have a gig speed or not, and we've got 10 or more devices connected. I think when you get 10 miles outside of Billings, that's a different discussion.
Yes, it is a little different discussion. And we're a micro-urban center, a broad span. We're the largest community in a 500-mile radius, if you can believe that. So things look different in rural communities. What are the other fundamentals for a strong recovery plan, given what we understand today about the market and the other things that are at play?
Oh, may I be a little bit controversial with you, Steve?
I would expect nothing less. I've heard that about you, Jon.
So it's less about going on to the football field and adjusting the game plan, but suddenly having to tell all the players, we're not playing football anymore.
Yeah.
This is soccer now, or this is basketball, or this isn't a game at all. And I think that radical a shift is necessary. It's no longer about just changing the game plan. This is a different game. And of course I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I think there's value in this because Tracye alluded to it already. We're not getting back to normal. We're not getting back to normal. The notion that we have worked in offices and we're going to go back to working in offices, I think that's not an assumption you can make. And, we've had steady increase in airline travel. That affects this is the ripple effects now. If you're in Seattle, it affects Boeing's production of planes. Yeah. So I think each one of these things, this is an amazing moment to rethink what arena we're even in, never mind changing the game plan.
Totally agree with that. And, as you create your playbook, that's the way you need to think of your strategies and your recovery. It's just a playbook, and you'll be able to deploy those strategies as you need. But you also need to keep in mind that and we've used this pivot all the time, you need to be able to make adjustments and go forward because it won't look the same. I don't think you're exaggerating, Jon. I think some communities need that jolt to know that this is the new norm. And, if you think about it, just the context of what we've been through, and Jon has used this before, we've had 3 significant shocks this century: 9/11, the 2008 banking crisis, and now we have 3 crises going on at one time. Yeah. The health crisis, global recession, and then this unraveling of a social fabric that we see across the country. This is unprecedented. And so we need to look at it and treat it as if, and I would also add, it may be that time to kind of unbundle it so we can take advantage of the opportunities that are presented before us. I joke and say, I always wanted a time where I could take a break. We're working 24 hours.
I agree.
We got a break, man. Look, from March until where we are now, we've had an opportunity to really not only take a look at our lives, but take a look at our business operations in our communities. And I think we need to think about it from that perspective too. What would I do different now that I have this opportunity? And I think that's where communities will really get it if they take the time to just unpack that whole bundle of who were we? And were we going in the right direction? And now that I've had a pause, what do I do with this opportunity?
So instead of saying, hey, Steve and the economic development team, can you just put us back to where we were before this all started? That's really not the dialogue we need to have. It's hey, what have we learned about ourselves and how we function in the community and our business? and how does that prepare us for the future? I had an opportunity to talk with this team several months ago, and I started the conversation about we need to be kind of thinking about stage 3, and stage 3 in our plan is, hey, there's some future, there's what we want to look like beyond that we have to start talking about. And somebody raised their hand in that Zoom meeting we were on and said, Steve, we can't afford to talk about the future. People are hurting today. Businesses are closing today. So is it okay now to be talking about what that future looks like? Is that an okay conversation to have? Can we be spending time in this stage 3? What do we look like beyond? Or is it too insensitive right now to do that?
Steve, I think you have to do it. And it doesn't mean that you stop doing the immediate recovery things. But let me give you an example, and this too will be very controversial. But if your action in the short term is to prevent every retail business from going under, if that's your short-term vision, and you don't take that long-term view, the long-term view would say, maybe we need to look at triage. Maybe we need to acknowledge the fact that certain businesses won't survive in this new environment. And you wouldn't ask that question until you took the longer-term view. And I don't mean to suggest for 1 second that this is easy. This is not easy, but it's honest. And the results may be much more beneficial to Billings and the region than saying we need every small business, every small retail business to survive, because not every small business retail outlet will survive. And in some case, and this is the controversial part, nor should it.
So for a community like Billings, and you've probably touched and been a part of work throughout the country with communities like us, what opportunities should we be paying attention to?
You know, one of the things that I'll throw out, and we talked about broadband infrastructure based on presence. You know, did we have enough for school, homeschooling? Was it rural areas where we had these spots and gaps where people were not connected? You know, the whole discussion on broadband today is an infrastructure question, and it becomes a utility versus a luxury. So, for example, we see a lot of our workforce now working from home. If you're going to be, you know, your future, you're going to look at talent attraction. That broadband infrastructure is a must now more than ever if you're even looking at talent attraction, because remote workers want to make sure they're connected. That's their lifeline to their employers. If you have gaps and if you're not ready for that, you're not ready for that workforce. You're not going to be attracting the talent. So that's a real-time issue that has future impact that communities need to be looking at.
That's a very good way to put it, real-time issue that has future implications, future opportunities. What other fundamentals, Jon, Tracye, do you think as we look beyond where we're at today and look to seize opportunities, what other fundamentals should we be paying attention to?
So let me give you a very long-winded answer, Steve. But way back in March, when this was first really hitting, and I remember it very well, and I think most of us do, because March 13th was Friday the 13th.
Yes.
And it was the day where if you can pick a date, that'd be the date you picked. And it was the last day we sort of did things. March 14th was my birthday, so I was very vivid in my memory. I still had friends flying in from other parts of the country to visit. And even then we were wondering, is this a good idea? And then, of course, by the time they flew home, those who could fly home on Monday had trouble doing it. Everything had changed. And so we started getting on the phone. And among the very earliest phone calls I made was to people in the corporate world. And one of those people is Mike Haddad. He's the CEO a multi-billion-dollar cheese distribution and manufacturing. They have factories all over the world. And Green Bay is one of our clients. They're headquartered in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And over the objection of his board, in a commitment to the downtown, he had put in this beautiful new 50,000 square foot headquarters. And it was, of course, by the time I called him, which was early April, it was empty. And he said, this was way before all the things that you've already been reading about. He said, I don't think we'll ever use that building as it was intended for again. We are going to be, the term he used was hoteling. We will be hoteling employees, but the notion that those who worked in that environment will return to that environment, we've already given up on that. And that was at the end of March, Steve. So my next phone call was to Scott Adams, who is the city manager of Las Vegas. Scott's a friend of the firm, and I asked him the same question. And he said, we are already making the adjustments as a city that will change our thinking about where our services are, and he literally created a call center with using his employees that handle things like permitting and licensing and so forth. And he was able to cut the workforce in half and not have them come into the office at all. Suddenly, he was saying the same thing that Mike Haddad at the company was saying, is that we have moved to a different level of efficiency and resiliency like that. It was possible before, there was no great momentum to do it, and now we're doing it. We're doing it partly out of necessity and partly out of the cost, and partly out of the fact that in many cases our employees actually like it better. So this is really to underscore what Tracye said early on. We're not returning to the way things were. It was never efficient to do them that way in many cases in the first place. So why continue to do them? To your question about what it means for Billings and your positioning in Billings, I think it begins with a recognition, and this is not futurism. This is not what's 2040 going to look like. Right. This is understanding the trends that have been in place and taking advantage of those. So then you see, oh, wait a minute. As Tracye was saying, if we have broadband, we can really engage in a different kind of talent attraction. We can go out and evaluate our individual businesses to see how ready they are to sell online, and can they be competitive online. When we talk about entrepreneurship, it's not just starting new retail businesses. It's about, what does a high growth business look like? How does it fit into this new economy? So I think that, to me, for all of the discouraging aspects of where we are, there are tremendous opportunities available to communities.
I think so too.
Thanks, John. Tracye, other thoughts on some fundamentals for us as we look to seize future opportunities?
Well, what I'd like to do is, John had a couple of weeks ago, maybe even a week ago, a tremendous opportunity to be in front of several economic development leaders at IEDC for a strategic planning session. And it became somewhat of a focus group. And he was able to get some really good information. So I would like to go back and ask him, John, were there anything that you heard from the economic developers around the country during that session that could be something Billings could use as far as how these communities are positioning themselves?
Well, thank you for pushing the question back, Tracye. There were 90 people in that session, so pretty healthy group, and we asked a series of questions having to do with how soon they thought the recovery would gain momentum, how likely it was that these social equity and other sort of shocks to the system would go away, and actually have the numbers. And in the case of the shocks to the system and the likelihood that we will be on a normal recovery path in the next 12 months, it was over 80% felt we would not be. There were, however, deep divisions on how aggressive we should be in the incentive policies associated with that. And I did not specify whether the incentives were national or local. It was just an open-ended question.
Right.
But what was intriguing was that they were so deeply divided on the incentive question.
My question to you is, does the theory still make sense given what we're going through? And the theory is that talent drives your economic future, new private investment, new entrepreneurship. Companies want to be where talent wants to be. And talent wants to be in a community that has strong quality of place. So if I want to attract talent, because if I have talent, I can attract more private investment, then I have to be a community that invests in itself and grows my amenities and grows my infrastructure and become that quality of place. So that's my theory. I start with building the kind of place that talent wants to live in and stay in. And by doing that, I become really attractive for new private investment, for entrepreneurship and business growth in my community. Does that still hold true as we are in the middle of COVID?
I would say even more so. Earlier, we talked about that broadband infrastructure and how important that is and could be potentially for talent attraction. So I would say now even more, and even more importantly, communities need to look at how they become more resilient, how they become more stronger, how they raise up these most vulnerable populations and areas where they are an active part of the economic prosperity and mobility. And I think young talent period, is going to be attractive and knowing how communities respond. So I think it's even more important today, Steve, that communities pay attention to that. And their approaches are very intentional, if you will, for even, we talked about the remote workers, but even retaining workers. Because now that we are in this remote worker stage, even your talent can be attracted and move on to other communities. So there is, as much as the game about attracting companies is important, now we're going to have even tenfold efforts to attract your talent and move them out into other communities that are trying to do the same thing that you're doing.
So John, I have another theory, and that is, given what I'm seeing going on around the nation, that a smaller urban hub like Billings that has this more vast space, more space for you, less commute times, more affordability, suddenly becomes maybe more attractive than it was, because folks are maybe wanting to leave East or West Coast or wherever it might be. They're wanting a different experience, and that we still have some of the amenities of a what I call a micro or a mini urban center, but we have also the blessing of the wide open spaces and a little more elbow room between people. Is a community like Billings uniquely positioned now?
Let me give you some data, Steve. So 3 weeks ago, there was an anonymous survey, that a Twitter endorsed survey of 4,400 Bay Area tech workers, right? So pretty significant number. 4,400 tech workers in the greater San Francisco area were surveyed, and 2/3 of them said they would consider leaving the region permanently if allowed to work from home. 2/3 of them said they would consider leaving the area permanently if allowed to work from home. Now, but let's unpack that. I mean, on the one hand, yes, it supports your view that other communities can be competitive, but I want to underscore what Tracye said. This game is being played nationwide, and you are also vulnerable to lose your talent pool to other communities that are doing the same thing. Here's the missing ingredient, I think, that we are seeing, the mistake, if you will, that other communities are making. They're trying to reach those talented individuals that they would love to have in their community individually. And they forget that they are actually working for a company. So to think that you will pick off those individuals without also having a relationship with the tech companies themselves, I think is one of those critical mistakes that a community can make. And so if your next question is, well, all right, how do we establish those relationships? That's where I think the creativity of the community itself comes into play. And that creativity is around things like developing smart cities programs, doing the things that Las Vegas and Austin and I wouldn't compare myself just to other small communities. It doesn't matter that you're not like Toronto or that you're not like Austin. There's still lessons to be learned from what those cities are doing. And what you do is you create opportunities on behalf of the city to work with these tech companies, all of whom are eager to do it in everything. We see this in Arizona with the self-driving vehicles. We've seen it in Idaho. We see it in different states where they're making these relationships with corporations possible. And then you have in Green Bay, where they reached out to Microsoft, and Microsoft is doing some amazing things with TechSpark. So Green Bay is more like Billings than Austin, Texas is. So it can be done. It is being done. But it takes more than just saying, how do I attract the talent pool? It's really, how do I establish what makes my city dynamic? And I don't mean dynamic just in terms of how many eateries you have or how many dog parks you have, wonderful as that may be. But what is the corporate relationship? That's what people aren't looking at, Steve. And by the way, I'm not knocking dog parks. I love dog parks.
That's
Tracye,
great.
anything to add?
Yeah, the interconnectivity of the city, but I really want to underscore what Jon said. And I think it's something to really think about. If you think about your attraction strategy for talent, and today we are looking at companies that would be more amenable to set up these satellite hubs than they would to relocate a full operations. So if you think about that, Google now will have satellite hubs small all over in several places or key markets around the country, or other companies like that, tech companies, to accommodate these remote workers so there's connection with their workers and the firm. That's huge. And that's a game changer in the way we need to think about how we're doing our business. So I think it's really important to approach it that way from an employer versus that individual. It's so key because now real estate, the way we think about it, is totally different also. So those footprints in different markets can be more obtainable today than the old bricks and mortars used to be.
Tell me what does that call to action look like for a community like Billings?
I'll jump in if it's all right with Tracye. I mean, I think the first thing is Montana has always wanted to live in a bubble. And it's tempting to want to continue to do so, and nothing could be more wrong. The notion that you somehow can exist outside of the economic dynamics of the country as a whole was never true, of course, but is less true now than it ever was. So getting outside of the bubble, I think, is absolutely essential. And part of that bubble has been for you a long-standing ease or comfort with natural resources. And if you look at this question of accelerating trends and you have an honest discussion about oil and gas and timber and mining, I think it is not an easy conversation. We're in Texas. It's not easy for us. It wasn't easy for us to see oil prices go negative, and we have good friends that we talk to in the press and elsewhere that are saying, we may have reached an inflection point on oil and gas. and coal, I think we've passed that inflection point. So the notion that Montana can function and think in terms of economic opportunity as if it were a given that the things that Montana produces will always be desirable, I think that we have to step back from that.
No, I think that's so true. You know, one of the things I was able to take a look at your plan, and there was a quote in there that grabbed me, and it was move to where the puck will be and develop for what will be, not what was. I think that's still true. And I think that is even more true today, that we have to build for a future that we may not be comfortable with right now. We have to use data to understand our community better than we ever have before, because all of those things are changing. And we can find the answers if we just sit back and use the data from your community, whether it's labor numbers, whether it's poverty, whether it's the workforce, all of that information is going to tell your future story. And so being able to incorporate that into your recovery approach is more critical today than ever.
I love that line, Tracye, tell your future story. We can kind of write that chapter in the book, right now, that we want to live. The theme of our annual meeting is build beyond. For many years, our theme has been building remarkable. Let's build a remarkable community. Here we are today. So we're kind of transitioning. We know we need to build and invest in our community. I'm trying to encourage the community to look to build beyond what we knew before. Not that what we knew before was bad or anything else. It's just there's a different things at play today than what was at play 8 months ago. And so how do you lean into those things so that you're building beyond? And I think your insights have been fantastic today. Appreciate the work that we've done with TIP and your team and your willingness to share with us today. I'll give you guys each a chance at a closing remark, and then we'll wrap up.
Well, I'll jump right in. I love the way you're positioning for your legislative session. I love the way you're positioning your remarks for your annual meeting, because one of the things you can add to it is your future depends on it. All of those things, to think outside of the box, you have to do it today, because there is going to be a more robust competitive environment nationally and globally. And we need to think of it like that. If you never thought we were a global society, you got to kind of wink, wink at this pandemic, right? So yeah. All of these things are going to impact the future of Billings as we move forward. So I think you're spot on.
Thanks, Tracye. Jon, a closing comment from you.
No, I think Tracye's comments were spot on. I think recognizing, as she said, that this is a fiercely competitive environment, but that really not thinking so much about the silver bullet and understanding what factors have to be weighted to ensure that you're going to have a more equitable outcome. And equitable in your case certainly also means rural urban.
Yep,
I think right. That is where the pressure points are going to be, and getting ahead of those will put you in a much more competitive position. So I really appreciate having the time with you, Steve.
Thank you both, Tracye, Jon, and your whole team. Great partners of ours. We really appreciate it. Take care.